Diarmaid, when you heard about for the first time about the Tuam babies and what Catherine Corliss basically has discovered, were you surprised?
I wasn't surprised, no. I think anyone who hears about what is being described as a mass children's grave is going to be shocked about that. But when you actually begin to think about the infant mortality rates in Ireland in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, during those decades, and when you consider that the infant mortality rate for children born outside of marriage was sometimes 5 times higher than those born within marriage, you can begin to see why there would have been so many babies dying, and particularly in institutions where infectious diseases could spread quite quickly, where children, it appears, were often malnourished and were quite delicate to start with. It's perhaps not surprising when you then begin to look at the accumulation of deaths. But of course there's still going to be a surprise and an anger when people hear of those kind of total figures. But if you are aware of the network of institutions that existed in Ireland in the 19th and the 20th century, a whole variety of institutions, and given what we have learned over the last 20 years about these institutions, you do get to a stage where you are not shocked by revelations, further revelations, about what might have gone on in those institutions. And I say what might have gone on in those institutions because we still haven't uncovered the facts of what went on in those institutions.
What do we know? What treatment would those children get and their mothers?
What we do have is fragments. We have fragments of information. We have bits and pieces of information about different institutions. We have concerns being expressed within government and on the part of civil servants and inspectors of these institutions that the infant mortality rates were very high, that there was overcrowding in some cases, that there were many concerns being expressed about the appropriateness of young women and children being in these institutions. So there were a variety of concerns being expressed at various stages. There were also a variety of documents that would suggest that people also believed that these institutions had a role to play in reforming individuals, in punishing individuals, in ensuring that these individuals were kept from public view. There was a stigma attached to them, there was a shame attached to them. There was a reliance on these institutions, and we know that it suited the state in many respects to abrogate responsibility for the welfare of these individuals to religious congregations. It was a solution for the state. And you've got to remember that the state in the 1930s and the 1940s has not developed a significant approach to welfare or has not developed a welfare state itself. So they are very reliant on others to provide services, to provide social services and to provide institutional care. So there are a variety of different interest groups here. We also have to be aware of society at large and its dependence on these institutions. These institutions provided a solution sometimes to a communal shame, to a community shame, and sometimes to an individual family's shame that arose as a result of pregnancy outside of marriage. And you know, you've got to look at all of the different groups for whom these institutions were providing some sort of a solution. What we're much more aware of now is the reality of what it was like to be in one of those institutions. There's been much more of an emphasis in Ireland in recent years on personal testimony. What did it feel like to be in one of those institutions? What did it feel like to experience that stigma? What did it feel like to experience that sense of exclusion? So we've much more of a sensitivity now to those personal experiences and that personal testimony.
And a sensitivity that didn't exist in those days.
I think an awful lot of the issues around the status of women generally in our society, and in particular the status of the unmarried mother and indeed the illegitimate child, they were often shrouded in a language that was legalistic, that was heavily judgmental. They were referred to as offenders, as hardened sinners, as immoral. It's a very judgmental language. It's a language we associate with moral panic in the earlier years and earlier decades of the state's existence. And obviously there wasn't space for the individual's voice to be heard amidst all of these judgments being made about them. And they certainly were not a part of public discourse to the extent that they are now. And even, you know, as historians, when we're going through archives and we're going through documents from the 1930s and the 1940s, these are very much documents that are kept behind closed doors. These are matters that are not being discussed to any significant degree in public.
Yeah. We did see reports from inspectors from the 1930s in the Tuam home, for instance. And just the description about the children was, in a sense, quite damning in itself.
Yeah.
But this there was never acted upon.
I mean, what we've had also is some information on individuals who were expressing concerns about what went on in these institutions. And they would sometimes visit a specific institution and express grave concerns about the condition of the children and about the way the institutions were being run. And we do know that Bessborough, one of the mother and baby homes in Cork, was temporarily shut down as a result of one of these inspections. But the question then arises, why were other institutions not shut down, or why were other institutions not subjected to the same kind of oversight? And what was the extent of the oversight? Again, we have to move beyond fragments. There is not going to be any definitive history of the mother and baby homes. There's going to be no definitive history of these institutions generally, but we have to aspire towards as complete a picture of what went on as is possible through the available documentation. And that documentation will be spread across a variety of different institutions and government departments and religious orders and local authorities. And what has to be done now, in the same way was done with the Magdalen laundries, is a trawl through all of the relevant archives to see if we can get a comprehensive picture. Not a definitive picture, because I don't think that can exist, but as comprehensive a picture as possible.
The government has set up a committee now to investigate, or that's going to happen. Is that the first right step?
I think the government announcement of the establishment of a statutory commission is certainly the first step, and the correct first step. The difficulty now is, how do you define the parameters of any investigation? How do you define a mother and baby home? Even that most basic question does not lend itself to an easy answer. You know, what constitutes a mother and baby home? And do you make all of the links between the various institutions, not just the mother and baby homes, but the county homes, the former workhouses, the industrial schools, the reformatory schools, the Magdalen laundries? And then what about those who were forced out of the country as a result of the treatment of unmarried mothers? Do they come within the remit of an investigation? So it's going to be very difficult to establish terms of reference that will please everybody and will address the concerns of so many different individuals who were affected by so many different institutions. But they are all linked. And ultimately, what links all of these institutions is poverty. Those who were in those institutions were poor.
But should all those institutions be included in investigation, do you think? Or is that impossible to do?
I don't think it's possible to include all of those institutions without any investigation becoming completely unmanageable. This is one of the great difficulties of trying to investigate this complex history. There's such a network of different institutions and such a network of different alliances that are supporting these institutions that, you know, to try and unfurl that very complicated history within one investigation is going to be very difficult. We know, for example, in 1999 that there was an announcement made that the government was establishing an investigation into the industrial school system. And again, there were many of those institutions. And that was something that took over 10 years to be compiled. And still, there were going to be questions. And still, there were going to be questions raised as to whether it had uncovered everything that needed to be uncovered. But I think one of the things that comes out of it very strongly, out of previous investigations, is the power of the personal testimony and the vindication that can come for people who for so long had stories to tell and nobody to listen to them. And that has been a feature of many of the investigations, whether it's the industrial schools or the institutions that were being run by religious orders that affected children, or the Magdalen laundries, that we begin to hear some of the voices of those affected. So I think any investigation into the mother and baby homes is going to have to include, in a very central way, those voices, the experiences of people who were in those institutions.
And that's probably the most important thing. like you said, they get a voice now, which they never had.
It's been one of the fascinating issues for social historians over the last few decades to look at the amount of personal testimony, of witness statements, of people talking about their experiences, because it's one thing to get an administrative history of these institutions, how they were run, what are the statistical returns, what were the finances of these institutions, what's the extent of the paperwork in relation to oversight or lack of oversight. It's another thing to get the voices of the individuals and to get the voices of victims. So we really do need to ensure that process continues. And it also needs to be recorded for posterity. You know, when you consider the significance of this in relation to the overall history of Ireland in the 20th century, people need to know what happened. And people in 100 years from now need to know what happened. So, you know, for individuals who are affected, of course, it's much more immediate, and it's very important that they're heard. But this is significant in the long term also, that this difficult aspect of our history is confronted insofar as it can and is recorded insofar as it can be. But we also have to be careful about scapegoating. We have to be careful about outrage, about sensationalism. We have to be careful about rushing to pronouncements and definitive declarations of what happened. And, you know, this erroneous assertion that 800 bodies were dumped in a septic tank, that is not true. And yet there is this rush when these scandals break. There is a rush to judgment, and there sometimes is a rush to scapegoat. None of these institutions and those running them were one-dimensional. There are a lot of different factors that we have to be aware of. We need to be conscious of context, of perspective, of trying to understand the impulses of those decades through the lens of those decades. And that's not about in any way diminishing or lessening the gravity of what happened, but it is about trying to understand and trying to uncover the evidence that is available. And we have to be careful, I think, that the understandably emotional response to these scans initially does not cloud the need for perspective and context.
Can anyone be blamed?
No one individual, no one congregation, no one government department can be blamed for these scandals and for the excessive reliance on institutions. What's striking about the Irish situation is just the extent of the reliance on institutions. And it went on much longer in Ireland than it did in other countries. Other countries had these institutions, but they recognised at an earlier stage than Ireland did that they were not appropriate, that they had gone well past their sell-by date. It was very slow, that process in Ireland. So that leads to all sorts of questions about how society viewed them, about who was reliant on them. And again, you can't isolate one particular group or one particular institution. So we don't need or shouldn't be looking to blame a particular group or a particular institution. We have to look at this in the round. And that's an issue for society and its communal past, because there is an element of communal guilt around these scandals, because people are well aware that they were shunned. And they weren't just shunned sometimes by state or sometimes by church. They could also be shunned by their own people. And they're very difficult questions. And there's no point in singling out the religious congregations as having sole responsibility either, because they were again a part of an approach that had many players and many different individuals involved. So we have to be conscious of that. And we also have to be conscious that there were those who believed from the 1920s onwards that these institutions were being run for the benefit of these young women, that it was a way of taking them out of the former workhouses, the county homes, and putting them in institutions that would perhaps hold out the chance that they could be reintegrated in society after their children had been born. Now that often didn't happen, but that was one of the reasons why they were established in the first place in the 1920s.
Yeah. So if there's a question of blame, you could say at best Irish society can be blamed, but not individual institutions or people. Basically.
Well, historians are not in the blame game, and they shouldn't be in the blame game. And I mean, moral outrage can sit very uncomfortably alongside historical research. It's not that we are completely removed from the environment in which we live and work. We can be angry and upset and distressed as citizens, but our function as historians is to try and uncover, insofar as we can, the evidence that is there. So when it comes to blame, we need to be much more aware of the need to establish what happened, as opposed to trying to attach blame, because again, that impulse to blame or sometimes to scapegoat can actually do damage to historical research.
To historical research, but we heard from a lot of some of the so-called fallen women and their children yesterday. They want compensation for what's been done to them. So how are you going to determine that, and who's going to pay? So in a sense, that is going to be part of a blame game.
Yeah. Another issue that has arisen repeatedly over the last 15 or 20 years is the question of compensation or redress. If you establish, insofar as you can, what happened and who was affected by that, is there then an onus on current state and society to fund some kind of a redress scheme? There clearly is. And there are precedents for that. People who experienced brutality in industrial schools, for example, were entitled to apply for compensation. But that process, of course, is not without its own difficulties in relation to establishing the degree, to which people are entitled. How do you establish, again, the parameters of any compensation scheme? But there is no doubt that there will be individuals who have been affected by these institutions who will feel that words are not going to be enough, that they do want some form of compensation. And they are not motivated by money. There's no question of that. I think the overriding motivation for the vast majority of people who are affected by institutionalizations has been to get the truth.
Recognition. Yeah.
And they want recognition of their experiences, and they want validation of their experiences. So many of these things were buried for so long. And as was stated in a government document in the 1950s in relation to the amount of unmarried mothers who were leaving Ireland, the unmarried mother's greatest need is secrecy. So the idea now is that we should be mature enough to be able to confront that excessive reliance on secrecy of the past by being open about these issues, so that these individuals who are in a position to tell their stories don't have to be secret anymore.
Yeah. This is not, no, first go back to the Tuam home. This is the first example we've really heard about, but like you said, this is not the only one. Just to give an idea, how many of these mother and babies homes did Ireland have?
We cannot say definitively at the moment how many mother and baby homes there were. Now that might seem extraordinary, but you've got to realise that there were different types of homes that could be considered mother and baby homes. We know about the large homes that were being funded by the state and sometimes the local authorities and run by religious orders. But there were also private mother and baby homes that weren't necessarily in receipt of state funding. There were lodging houses, or what were euphemistically referred to as lodging houses, where those who perhaps could afford to go down the private route could avail of those services. So there's a whole network of different institutions that could, if you define it quite broadly, be classed or classified as mother and baby homes. We don't yet know how many of those institutions there were, but there were institutions all over the country that perhaps could be considered mother and baby homes.
Yeah.
So I can't give you an exact figure.
No, but just this was not the only one. I want to just get that clear. Yeah. Last year we saw the report on the Magdalene laundries with, of course, the series of abuse scandals within the church. Is it a coincidence that all these stories are coming out now? What has changed in Ireland that suddenly Ireland is looking at itself in the mirror and is facing its past?
One of the big changes has been the collapse in the authority of the Catholic Church in Ireland. You've got to consider from the foundation of the state how homogenously Catholic this country was. You know, in the Free State, what became the Republic, the 26 counties of Southern Ireland, you're talking about a Catholic population of over 94%. Deference was expected and often given. The Catholic Church was extraordinarily powerful in relation not just to religious observance, but in relation to education, in relation to healthcare, in relation to a whole variety of different areas. And it became so powerful that perhaps inevitably it abused that power. So what we've experienced in the last 20 years is an uncovering of that power, much more of a readiness to confront it, to name it for what it was. And because the church, the credibility of the church, the moral authority of the church has been so gravely affected by child abuse scandals and by the improper behaviour of its own personnel in some instances, it clearly wasn't in a position anymore to retain the kind of control it had. And that led to all sorts of questions. It led to all sorts of very robust investigations into various aspects of mismanagement by the church and into specifically clerical sexual abuse in particular dioceses. And what that began was a whole process of questioning not just the power of the church, but the entire model of governance of the church and the degree to which that model of governance was connected to other problems in Irish society. And you had much more confidence on the part of the Irish people about the appropriateness of questioning, vigorously questioning, the power that the church had and the power that the church abused. But it also came with social change, with more education, with an improving economy, with more of a sense of confidence about questioning traditional identities and traditional reliance on pillars of Irish society. There were a variety of different factors there, but also I think a growing societal awareness through the availability of personal testimony and memoir that there were deep, dark secrets that needed to be uncovered. One of the things that has been experienced in Ireland, for example, in the last 20 years is confessional radio. That's had an extraordinary impact, going right back to the 1980s, where you've had people who had stories that were, bottled up and washed down. They're suddenly coming into the open because they are reacting to particular scandals, such as the Tuam scandal. And suddenly, there are large numbers of people who have stories to tell that were hidden for so long. And there's much more of an appetite for those stories. They get much more of a reception now. There's a tendency to believe them when perhaps in earlier decades there wasn't. So people now have a variety of different fora for telling these stories. So there's been a whole variety of different factors that have ensured that there are questions raised about how things were done in the past, and there's much more of an environment that's conducive to revelation, exposure, and demands for the truth.
And how much of that is also driven by a certain amount of shame? Because we spoke to Catherine Corliss, and she told us the anecdote when she was a child, and she was in a class with those home babies, and she pulled a prank with them. In later life, she realized what it would have meant for those children to be treated in such a way. And she said, literally, it's one of her investigation was partially driven by this shame.
There's no doubt about that. I remember when I was a 9-year-old child being in Letterfrack in Galway, which was home to one of the most notorious industrial schools in Ireland, in the west of Ireland. And I was far too young to be remotely aware of what had gone on in Letterfrack behind the big, tall wall that I was looking at. And I asked my father what was in there. And he told me that was an industrial school. And I still remember to this day that he said terrible things happened in that school. And this was decades before any investigation or any revelations. So people knew. There's no doubt about that. And part of the response that we've had in recent times, and including in relation to the Tuam scandal, is a sense of communal shame. This history, this past, these terrible things, they belong to all of us. And there has to be some confrontation with that, and there has to be some sense of that being driven by a communal shame and a communal responsibility.
Because it's almost a contradiction the way Irish people see themselves. They pride themselves on being very social and warm, and they value family relationships. All these stories coming out is an absolute contradiction of that image, isn't it?
You could look at Irish identity as being riddled with contradictions when you place assertions about that identity alongside these very, very difficult stories and scandals. We're not unique in being riddled with contradictions in that regard. Yes, the Irish people are warm and social and hospitable and lay great store in the importance of family and community, and I wouldn't downplay those things, but that doesn't mean they are also carrying a very significant legacy that is about the complete opposite. of those kind of values. And you know, again, you've got to try and put that in the context of the times. Why did it happen the way it did? One of the reasons for these scandals is because there was such a gulf between the rhetoric of Irish identity and the attachment to family and community and caring and sharing, and the reality that so many people were experiencing. And the reality that was very uncomfortable for those in church and state, particularly when it came to a theme like the unmarried mother, because the existence of so many illegitimate children, as they were then defined, was completely at odds and at variance with the self-image of Ireland and with the rhetoric established to an Ireland that was pure and chaste and Catholic and holy, and venerated the mother and venerated, you know, various family models and community models. So yes, there are no shortage of contradictions there, and I think, you know, exposing those contradictions is part of grappling with the legacy of that era.
Yeah, Father Brian Darcy said, yes, we value family, but only one type of family was allowed in that culture. Yeah.
And I mean, this is the other thing about the classification that went on, and the extent to which poverty links all of these various scandals. Poverty links all of these various scandals because there was a distinction being made constantly on class grounds. There were those who were the respectable poor, those who were not the respectable poor. We have documents from the 1920s from the Catholic Church and from state that refer to the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And those classifications are based on class. So running through all of these scandals and the approaches to institutions is this question of class. And one of the great myths of Irish identity was that Ireland was a classless society. It emphatically wasn't.
You've described the change in Irish society. Is the church also changing? For instance, if you look at the way they responded initially to the abuse scandal, which was a reflex, defensive reflex, I think, tried to sweep it under the carpet. If you look at the way they respond now, for instance, the Tuam baby story, is there a difference?
There's a big difference in relation to the emphasis from the church now on apology, on humility. Not from everybody within the church, but from some, and from some very significant individuals in the church, including, of course, perhaps the most high-profile member of the Irish hierarchy, who's Dr. Diarmaid Ferriter, the Archbishop of Dublin, who from a very early stage when a lot of these scandals began to break, did something unusual for an Irish Catholic Archbishop. He went on television. He conversed. He held his hands up and said, terrible things happened, and for that we are truly sorry. Now, he was often ahead of some of his fellow bishops, but there was that emphasis on the idea of a new approach that was based on a much humbler and understanding church. One of the phrases that emerges repeatedly in previous investigations into clerical child abuse scandals is the need to avoid public scandal. Well, that can't be avoided anymore. And the church came to recognise, even though it was still trying to avoid public scandal up to relatively recently, it came to realise that you couldn't prevent that any longer, so you had to acknowledge it. But you know, the church is still very powerful in all sorts of ways. It still has an extraordinary control over education. 94% of Irish primary schools for young children are controlled by the Catholic Church. Now, it doesn't have the personnel, you know, to keep that kind of control over the education system. But you know, it's not that the Catholic Church in Ireland isn't relevant anymore. It emphatically is in relation to a variety of different areas. But it's not credible in relation to morality, personal morality, sexual morality. And it had such a preoccupation with those themes going right back to the late 19th century and particularly from the 1920s onwards. So it doesn't have credibility in that regard. But certainly there has been a change of emphasis on the part of the church. Less arrogance, less of a tendency to deny responsibility, because it can't anymore. Because as the information becomes available, it's quite clear that the church cannot sustain its historic denials and its refusal to take responsibility. So there's certainly been a sea change in that regard. But there's also been much more of a willingness to confront that church and for individuals to express great anger at the church and its personnel.
Yeah, we saw that yesterday with the march we passed.
Yeah, but you will also.
I think was it the church? Yeah, no, people were like literally shouting at it. Yeah. that would have been unheard of probably 25 years ago.
Well, I mean, challenging the church and its personnel was not something that was done until relatively recently. I mean, there were always a few courageous individuals who raised these difficult questions back when the climate wasn't remotely sympathetic to the raising of these questions. But there's been much more of a tendency in recent times for there to be a very vigorous questioning of religious orders, and that sometimes can be unfair because, again, you're not dealing with the majority of people who were involved in the Catholic Church during these decades in relation to these scandals. Not everybody who was working as a priest or a nun was involved in institutional care or indeed in institutional abuse. Many Irish people will pay tribute to the Catholic Church for the role they played in providing young and poor people with an education that they wouldn't otherwise have had. So again, there is a need for some degree of balance. But there's no doubt that there are many who will now agree with one of Ireland's leading trade unionists in the 1950s when he asserted publicly that this country has become so Catholic it's forgotten to be Christian. And they are words that have been echoing in my mind as a consequence of this Tuam scandal, because it seems to further highlight the degree to which he may indeed have been right.
Those pillars of society, like the church, the state, police, even though there's a big scandal with the police now, they're not untouchable anymore, like they probably used to be. How is it better Ireland going to look like? Is that it must be a good thing that these institutions are not untouchable anymore, but is it going to settle down at one point and then you have a different Irish society where everybody's more at peace with each other? I know it's a very broad question.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I think the process of trying to come to terms with all of these scandals is going to be a very, very long one. I'm even thinking of the amount of testimony that was given to the Ryan Commission into abuse in industrial schools. The enormity of that is going to take years, perhaps decades, to be absorbed and understood, and for it to make its way perhaps into a different kind of Ireland. The same perhaps is true of the kind of scandals that we're dealing with now. There's no overnight solution to these difficulties. There's no quick process. There's no quick remedy. Whether or not we'll all be better off as a result of it remains to be seen. There's much more of an emphasis now on accountability, on transparency. These are all buzzwords around, new models. But, we were also promised in politics a democratic revolution a few years ago. We've seen precious little evidence of that. So there will be a degree of cynicism about the extent to which an uncovering of more of these scandals or perhaps information about them might actually change us. I think certainly in the long run it will lead to much more of an awareness about where we've come from, which is very, very important for grappling with current identity, and that has to be a positive thing. It'll perhaps also be a positive thing that people are going to realise the consequences of the excesses of power and the abuses that come with those excesses from traditional pillars of society, that people will be much less likely to offer deference. That has to be a good thing.
I think the most striking thing that was said, what I heard this week, was from Franny Hopkins, and he's a quite an active member of Sinn Féin. He's a convinced Republican, but it was striking that he said we tend to blame everything on the British or the English, like what happened to us in the past, the poverty, the famine, everything. He said we did this to ourselves, and this is what we have to face. That's a mindset probably that's going to happen now. Yeah.
There's no doubt that a lot of the narrative of Irish history, the traditional narrative of Irish history, had been based on the idea that most of the things that were wrong with Ireland were as a result of colonial exploitation and British rule. There's still a lot of truth in that, because you also have the whole question of a post-colonial complex and how that can be difficult, and you have the legacy of many centuries of occupation. But a lot of these scandals have shone a light on domestic issues and domestic attitudes, and the idea, particularly from the 1920s onwards, that these were Irish problems, and those who were in positions of authority came up with Irish solutions to Irish problems that couldn't anymore be blamed on external forces or colonisation or British occupation. So there's certainly a degree to which, you know, there has to be an acknowledgement that these were homegrown, even though a lot of the infrastructure we're talking about was actually inherited from British rule. For example, the workhouse system was something that was a British inheritance. But the Irish solution to the Irish problem was not so much to get rid of the workhouses as had been promised by Irish Republicans a century ago, but just to rename them and to rename the workhouses county homes. That was an Irish solution to an Irish problem. So in many respects they did inherit a lot of the infrastructure from Britain. They didn't necessarily change it that much. But I think there's also going to be a focus, particularly coming up to 2016, which is the centenary of the seminal event of modern Irish republicanism, the 1916 Rising, on what is the nature of an Irish republic. What happened to the promise of the republic 100 years ago as it was articulated, particularly in relation to greater equality, particularly in relation to cherishing all the children of the nation equally, which was a line from the 1916 proclamation that declared a republic in 1916. You know, what are the values of an Irish republic? What were the values of an Irish republic? Did we ever really create one at all, particularly when it came to looking after those who were vulnerable and those who were poor?